Hi there. Welcome to Beyond the Comfort Zone podcast. My name is Teresa Waser from Physiotherapy, Fitness and Nutrition. On this podcast, I'll be interviewing experts about the various topics taught in fitness education to better understand the research, challenge some beliefs and biases, and provide helpful information to all the other health and fitness professionals out there who may have questions just like mine. Without further ado, let's get on with the show. Now, please remember that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. See you soon. Hi, everybody. Happy to have you here. Welcome to the third episode of the Beyond the Comfort Zone podcast. We have an amazing episode ahead of us. It's going to be based on women's health. So we're going to talk about exercise, movement, performance, pain and other symptoms, and the different strategies that we can actually use to help remove some of the symptom and the pains. So I'll be introducing our guest for today, Teresa. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Yusra.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm super excited to finally have you on here. It's been in the books for ages now.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, right. So why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Teresa Waser. I am an orthopedic and pelvic health physiotherapist, and I am based out of Leduc, Alberta, over in Canada. And I own my own practice, RX Physiotherapy, where I work inside of a physio clinic that's within a CrossFit gym. So it's quite nice. We get to do kind of more, I guess you would call traditional things within our private treatment room, but then we also get to go and play out in the gym and do a lot of movement and playing with movement and changing pain, symptoms, performance, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, amazing. You do all sorts of things. Like you wear a lot of hats, right? Is that something that you've always wanted to do, or did that start with experience and you just found yourself doing all these different things?
Yeah, I really love learning, and I suppose I get bored quickly of things, and I always want to learn new things and explore and expand and evolve.
Yeah.
I think that if we're the same place for too long, that's not really how it's supposed to be. We're supposed to continually grow, I think. I think
Absolutely.
the fun of life. And I know you're much the same.
And I love that. And that's how we met, right? Through all the different courses that we're doing. And yeah, awesome. All right. So we'll dig into today's topic, which is improving pain and performance with movement and symptom science. Now, my question is, what is symptom science and what factors do you think can contribute to one's symptoms?
So symptom science is really taking pain science. So many people nowadays are familiar with the term pain science, and it's really expanding from pain to symptoms in general. So sometimes we'll have someone that we're working with that is truly having pain, but sometimes they are having maybe some prolapse symptoms. So maybe they're feeling some pressure, some heaviness, maybe they're reporting like a tampon sensation, or maybe they're feeling like a tightness or a discomfort or a pulling sensation somewhere that's not truly pain, but is nevertheless a symptom that is bothersome for them and that they're wanting to seek our help to change that. So symptom science is about understanding that pain and other symptoms are 100% of the time always a product of the central nervous system. And this idea, which, again, this is something that we're becoming more and more familiar with in, the health and fitness communities, is that, issues in the tissues do not directly equal our symptoms. So yes, those can be contributing factors, but just having issues in the tissues is not sufficient for us to have symptoms. So the central nervous system still needs to decide, is there relevance to that information that's coming from those issues in the tissues? Is it something that there is perceived threat associated with? And it's going to, our central nervous system, take into consideration both the incoming messages that could be coming from tissue-related things with relevance, with context, with any perceived threat, and then decide whether or not it needs to, tell us about it, basically. And those are things that we can potentially affect change on. So in terms of threat, as an example, we can dial threat up and we can dial threat down through a number of different things. And the sensitization within any given individual is going to be something that is modifiable as well. So really looking at things from, yes, we still care about the tissues. Yes, we still care about movement and load and volume and all of that stuff. That still applies and that's still very important. But widening our lens to also look at all the other things that could potentially be contributing to that symptom development and symptom provocation, so that we can help people to move forward with their goals without symptoms weighing them down.
I love that. I love that. And that goes really well into my next question. Now, I'm not sure how it works in a physio school, but a lot of fitness education is based around the postural structural biomechanics model, so the PSB model, right? Where exercise prescription is very black and white, sort of, right? You either do it this way or you're doing it wrong. You either deadlift this way, lunge this way, or you are doing it wrong. You can have some people go as far as telling people, if you can't do it right, don't do it at all. Now, we are talking about exercise and movement that can actually increase someone's quality of life, right? These are the movements that they do day in, day out at home. Movements that they can't avoid. So what I would love to hear from you is, what are your thoughts on the model, the PSB model, and the impact it has on the people who don't fit in that model, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think it relates very much back to what we were just talking about in terms of symptom science. So when we are thinking about posture, when we're thinking about biomechanics, and we're thinking about structure, that very much tends to be based in that thinking of issues in the tissues as being the primary symptom driver, and we have to potentially modify posture, modify what we're doing in order to create, a change to protect what's going on at the tissue level. But when we don't have to look far to see many examples in medicine where those issues in the tissues are not reflective of what the clinical presentation is. Everything from asymptomatic labral tears in hips, right, being like 38%, really high stats depending upon your age group for asymptomatic disc herniations. We see this in prolapse as well, where we have, some individuals who have very mild descent, so what we would consider like to be a grade 1 prolapse, that have significant symptoms that are quite debilitating in their everyday life. And then other individuals, which would be, what we would consider a grade 3 prolapse, much more structural descent than the grade 1, and yet they have very little, sometimes no symptoms at all. How can that be? And for sure, we know that this is because symptoms are much more than the structure. And so I think that filters down into the idea of, posture and biomechanics and technique stuff. I think that all of those rules that we have been kind of handed down came from a very good place, and they work sometimes, right? So if we have someone as an example who has prolapse symptoms, and we can think of the rules that we might hear of with that. So some of the rules might be, oh, you always need to exhale on exertion, or you always need to keep your ribs in line with your hips. or never lift heavy, or don't squat deep, or there's so many different myths that we've heard in regards to prolapse, just as an example. But that's not necessarily going to be true for everyone. And if we look at, so if we just take as an example, pressure, and the idea, the rule that we should exhale with exertion. If we really look at the pressure research studies, we can look at the range of those pressure variables, and we can see that in some individuals, their pressure reading will be higher with an exhale than it will be on an inhale, or in some cases even on a breath hold. So if that is true, potentially that exhalation is not going to be the best option for that individual. And potentially they're going to feel better with their symptoms if they do something like an inhale, or potentially even, I know this can, what? How can that be? But potentially even like a breath hold they might.
Right? Everybody's freaking out about the breath hold.
Yes. And but the thing is that we're individuals and we have multiple different things that are happening. And the problem with rules is that they then trap us.
Yeah.
So if I have someone who is in to see me and they're wanting some help with their prolapse symptoms, say they're squatting, and my only rule, the only thing that I have to guide me is exhale with exertion. And exhale with exertion actually within this individual and how their nervous system is functioning, and what they're doing with all the different things that contribute to pressure, that interplay. If in this individual exhalation is actually a higher pressure strategy, but that's my only option, then I'm failing to help this person to explore what could be really beneficial. So the problem with those rules, whether it's posture, breath, biomechanics, how people are moving, how the exercise technique is being performed, is that when we have this narrow view of what is acceptable, yes, it's going to help some people. So there are 100% going to be people that exhalation with exertion is going to be the thing that makes them feel the best. But it leaves behind the people that strategy is not going to be helpful for. And we don't want to do that. We want to be able to help the most people, the most amount that we can, and being very strictly focused on posture and biomechanics and all of these rules that we have been taught is, in my opinion, and what we see from research, not necessarily the ideal way to go.
Yeah. As for myself, after 4 kids, I do have a mild prolapse, and I notice that the days that I'm stressed, I can lift heavy and things like that, and I wouldn't feel anything, right? But the days that I'm stressed, and even if I haven't worked out, it will be the only thing I can feel all day. So it really kind of shows that, our psychosocial aspect, the stress that we're in, what surrounds us, the daily lives, it really does affect how we feel and the pain and the symptoms that come up, right?
Absolutely. And that's the other big part of that, is that when we're looking at that postural, structural, biomechanical model, and we compare it to the biopsychosocial model, it's really like that postural, structural, biomechanical, that PSB model is taking just the biomedical part of the biopsychosocial and just really, again, putting those blinders on and looking at that as if that is the most important thing. And yes, it's valid, and yes, it's important, and yes, we do 100% need to be aware of and considering of those factors, because they are important and they can have a big role in what's going on with the person in front of us. But we also need to be very much aware that those psychosocial factors can also be driving symptoms, in some cases more so than what's going on in that biomedical part. And where there are biomedical considerations, the psychosocial stuff is going to be creating a modulating effect on that, like that dimmer switch we can think of, right? So we can, like you were sharing with us with your experience, you find that stress maybe dials that sensitivity down a bit. Other things that can do that is lack of sleep.
Definitely.
can see within people that we're working with a bit of like a hypervigilance. So we can see people, particularly with pelvic floor concerns, who might be, having this belief that they need to be constantly engaging their pelvic floor. And if you think about any muscle within your body, so imagine, you had this belief that your head was going to fall off if you didn't shrug your shoulders up to support it. Yeah. Well, what would happen to those trap muscles in your upper shoulders if you did that all day?
Absolutely.
Probably have some symptoms. And is the issue that those muscles are really tight and we need to do some work and do some manual therapy and, do all this stuff to try to get your traps feeling better? Well, yeah, maybe that might help you temporarily, but really the driving factor in that case would probably be, around that belief that you have that your head's going to fall off if you don't shrug your shoulders up to support it. And we can see some of the same sort of things to be true, in other conditions within the body. Now, obviously, I hope there aren't a lot of people that their head is going to fall off if they don't do that. But just as a very hypothetical example that I just came up with on the spot.
It's awesome. All right. So my next question is, you have come up with an amazing acronym that can be applied when working with symptomatic individuals. Why don't you tell us what it is, how it came about, and how we can actually apply it?
Sure. So I came up with an acronym that we call TIIPPSS-FC. There is one T in this acronym, and then two I's, two P's, two S's, and then the FC. And this acronym was developed, it kind of came to be because I was traveling around with Anthony Lowe, the physio detective, who's one of my mentors and my good friends. And I help Anthony on his female athlete level 1, level 2, and the masterclass courses. And some of the things that I was finding kind of across North America and even, around the world, was that clinicians and fitness professionals, they were understanding the concepts, and they were, Anthony's, his kind of catchphrases, do something different. And they were understanding that, but then they were getting a little bit caught up on not knowing what to change. So for instance, if someone came in and they were having some prolapse symptoms and they were like, okay, do something different. I see your breath holding, might do something different. I'm going to get you to exhale. But then potentially not looking at that wider lens. Well, what else can you do? So what are your other options within, the pressure system that you could potentially change? And then, maybe they think about breath, maybe they think about posture and alignment, but then they weren't necessarily looking beyond that. So TIIPPSS-FC came about because I saw that there was a need for a simple and adaptable framework that people could use to change the experience that the person that was in front of them was having, hopefully very quickly, and also encompassing all the things that can affect symptom science. So do you want me to quickly go through?
That would be great, yeah.
Sure. So the first letter T is for tension. So tension really comes down to, again, Anthony Lowe's idea of tension to task. So this is the idea that for any given task or exercise, there likely exists an optimal amount of tension for that activity. So we don't want to do too much. We also don't want to do too little. It's that right amount, that Goldilocks amount of tension that is likely going to be best. And we can think about tension from a global standpoint, so a full body tension, or we could think about tension from a local level. And what's interesting is that tension can be driven consciously, right? So we could have someone that, a coach has told them, or they have this idea that they need to really brace, or they need to really grip their abs. Or maybe they've got this idea that they really need to tighten their pelvic floor when they're lifting. And maybe, they've never tried dialing it back. Or maybe it is a situation where we need to dial things up. Right? We do need to try different things. And then also another thing to consider is emotional influence on tension in our body. So just as an example, many different examples we could talk about, but someone who is running downhill, Now, obviously, there are many factors that we're going to chat about with the rest of the TIIPPSS-FC that could be playing a role, but an additional role that could be affecting tension is fear. So if we have someone who's running downhill and they're fearful of falling, or they're fearful that they're going to leak, that again can drive increased tension, and that could potentially be one of the factors that's feeding into their symptoms. Moving on from T, the first I is impact. And impact can be divided into impact of my body, or whoever body that I'm working with. So if I'm running or jumping, the impact of my body, right? So we can change that. We can change how we manage impact. So soft footfalls when we're running versus loud footfalls. Changing, just how we absorb the impact.
Yeah.
And then we can also think about, for some sports, the impact that could be imparted onto our bodies by equipment. So if it's someone who is doing, say, Olympic lifting, the impact of a barbell landing on their shoulders when they do a squat clean, as an example.
Clean or something like that.
Exactly. Or someone who's doing softball and the impact of a bat, or, maybe they're golfing. So, impacts of equipment can also be a factor as well. And those are things that we can potentially play with and adjust. The next I is irritability. And irritability is a few different things that we can consider. And it really depends on what the individual is having issues with. So if they're having gas or fecal incontinence, sometimes there might be some abdominal issues in terms of bloating and things like that are going on. We could potentially look at irritability within the gut and the GI tract. If they're having issues with leaking and urgency, urinary wise, we can look at bladder irritability. So things like bladder irritants that may be present in the foods or the drinks that we're consuming. And we can also look at MSK irritability from a pain standpoint. So Greg Lehman, he has, the nice catchphrase, calm things down, build things back up. He uses one other word that's different than that.
You can use it. But yeah.
But yeah, in terms of MSK or musculoskeletal irritability, sometimes we need to potentially just let things calm down before we can then build them back up. And so that irritability part of TIPPS is just having us take stock of, is there any of these things present that we may need to consider and modify in order for us to make progress moving forwards. The first P is posture and positions. And posture really refers to static alignment, how we would normally think about that. And positions is more postures that we're dynamically moving through. So as an example, if we are running, we can kind of think about that torso posture as being a posture, right? So our arms and our legs are moving, and yes, there is typically some thoracic rotation, but generally speaking, it is, a relatively a static posture versus, something like a squat snatch where we are moving, very quickly through a number of different positions. And we can potentially change posture and positions to change symptoms or to change performance, depending upon what the individual in front of us is dealing with. The second P after posture and positions is pressure. And pressure is really talking about that abdominal canister. And so we can change this based on changing our breath and or changing the muscular recruitment of the walls of the canister. And then moving on from there, the first S is strategy. And strategy is what all of the fitness professionals are so great at. It's really the stuff that you automatically think about changing, right? So changing range of motion, changing load, changing speed, changing the implement that you're using, right? So going from a barbell to a kettlebell, those kind of things. Changing the technique, in terms of, maybe taking a shorter step if they're doing a lunge, or allowing the knee to go a little bit more forwards, or to do a rear foot versus a front foot focus. All these different things that we can change the how of how the exercise looks. all the different scaling modifications that we can come up with, that all would fit into strategy. And then my favorite of the tips is the second S, and that's sensitivity. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is really all the different things that fit into that psychosocial category that we want to potentially look at in terms of stress, anxiety, depression, sleep, all the different things that can potentially be changing that dial. So dialing sensitivity up or dialing it down. And those are things that we can work on with people to help to identify if any of those factors are present and to change them over time. And a big component of this is examining and understanding where they're coming from and what their beliefs, attitude, meaning, and story is.
Your BAMS, right?
Your BAMS, yes. So that's sensitivity, and all of my favorite stuff is in there. Well, it's all great. But it's the stuff that so often gets overlooked, but is so important for generating change in many of the people that we work with, particularly those who are dealing with persistent symptoms.
And I think that part is where a lot of us fitness professionals haven't been exposed to in our education, right? It's not a part of what we are taught, and I think that's the major problem as well.
Yeah. And I would say that, to some extent, that's true for physiotherapy as well. We may get more than fitness professionals, I'm not sure. Probably depends on what training you've taken and all that kind of stuff. But, for the most part, I would say that, we need more and more warriors of this biopsychosocial approach so that we can continue to move it forward so that this is more widely accepted and more widely implemented for sure. Yeah. I agree. So
we have F and C left.
F&C, yes. So F and C, really and truly what I like to do is to try as best as we can to optimize the tips. And then once we've optimized the tips, then we're going to consider fatigue and capacity. And just before I touch on those, I just want to mention too, when we talk about tips, it can sometimes feel like overwhelming. Like, do I need to look at all these different factors? No, you certainly don't. What you might start to notice as you look at this framework and as you start to apply it is that these are interconnected. So I cannot change tension without also impacting pressure. I can't change strategy without also affecting tension and pressure. Like, they're all interconnected. So where you intervene doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you're going to change. And what you might want to do is just kind of take that step back with your coach's eyes or with your physio eyes or whatever other hat you're wearing and see what are the big rocks. What are the things that really stick out to you in terms of the tips? And then that's a good place for you to start. And then once you've tried to change some of those things, it could be that the first, one or two things that you change, you get big improvement. And then you could be, okay, great. You don't need to worry about the other ones. You don't have to look at everything if you don't need to. But it also gives you something to go back to so that if you get stuck, if you've tried a couple of things and you're like, well, what do I do now? What else can we try to modify? You can go back to that framework and you can say, okay, what else could be relevant for the person in front of me? And how else could I potentially try to improve things for this person? And that's likely to be an ongoing process, and tips don't ever stay the same. So another one of Anthony's things that he says is, for now, not forever. So particularly when we're trying to modify symptoms like pain, those modifications, the tweaks that we do, the tips, those don't necessarily have to stay the same forever. It could be that it's a temporary thing, and then, we are constantly dynamic and changing, and our, things just continue to change for us and our nervous systems and our capacity and all that kind of stuff. So we can continue to cycle back to those things over time as well. But moving on to the F and the C, fatigue is what I consider to be short-term, right? So this is something that we're all, probably very familiar with. But if we have, done a lot of things, potentially we've been in the gym for a long period of time, or we've had a really intense workout, the likelihood of our symptoms being a bit more likely to come on or a bit more provoked is going to be higher when we're in a fatigue state in many cases. Or that could be the mom that's at home with her kids and finding that her prolapse symptoms are the worst at the end of the day, and more so on days when she's tired because she's done a lot more activity. And so we can look at fatigue as something that we can potentially change as well. Now that could be also linking back to things like sleep quantity and quality. It could be looking at nutrition, right? If someone is really underfed or is not getting good nutrient quality, that can potentially be impacting their fatigue levels as well. Or it could be, just as a very easy example, I had someone who came in that was symptomatic with slam balls. And she noted that slam balls, typically she programmed those for the very end of her workouts. And so what we did was we tried to see if fatigue was the element there. And sure enough, when we put the slam balls earlier on in her programming, well, she wasn't symptomatic anymore. So, obviously there's other stuff going on there, and that's not the only thing we're ever going to look at, but it is an important consideration. We may also see that in people who have leaking, as an example, with double unders. If we are putting those double unders at the end of a long grueling WOD, the likelihood of them leaking could be higher than if that was kind of flipped around. And then capacity refers to longer term. So all of these things, like, yes, we can optimize the TIPPS, we can try to be considerate of what's happening with fatigue and trying to manage fatigue, but we also want to remember that even if we optimize the TIPPS, even if we're managing fatigue, there likely exists a current capacity that they have. And sometimes we just need to build that capacity out over time. And that could be in regards to improving pelvic floor muscle strength. It could be in terms of overall strength. It could be in terms of just nervous system changes that are occurring as we continue to change and evolve and adapt. And so, sometimes we optimize the things that we can, and then we need to, apply that stress to progress principle, apply the SAID principle of those specific adaptations to impose demands over time. And so that could be that we're going to be doing some interval training. And we're going to progressively, push things out slowly over time based on that individual's response and their recovery factors and their ability to do so. So yeah, that is TIIPPSS-FC. So hopefully that is a framework that is helpful for your listeners. And potentially we could, do you have show notes for this, Yusra?
I'm going to put some, and just, I'm going to type out what it all stands for, what it all means. What I would love to do next is go through some practical examples. So we can do running and leaking, as that's a lot, that's one of the issues that those with pelvic floor considerations tend to face a lot, right? So I think that would be a good one.
Yes, let's do it. So just to preface this, remember, we are going to apply TIPPS always individualized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of the tips for leaking with running, with the understanding that we would never, throw all of this at someone. So I'm going to go through all the different factors that we could potentially change with respect to improving leaking with running. But all the things that I'm going to talk about are not necessarily going to be applicable for any one given person. So within this, you would take what is like those big rocks, what seems to be relevant and applicable for the person that you're working with, and then you might some of the other stuff might not be applicable for that person. But for the purposes of being comprehensive, I'll go through all the tips. So with running, that first letter is T, that's the tension. So again, we can look at full body tension, and we can also look at pelvic floor tension. So we can ask them, when you're running, what are you thinking about anything in regards to your pelvic floor? If so, what? They may not be, or they may consciously be thinking about, I'm thinking about don't pee my pants, squeeze my pelvic floor. If that's the case, that's potentially something that we can try changing. If they aren't thinking about their pelvic floor, we may want to see if we can change that or not. One thing that I do not ever suggest with running is trying to get people to time their pelvic floor to their impact. You just cannot do that. Please don't tell people to do that. Our pelvic floor automatically and reflexively contracts in response to running in anticipation of foot strike. So this is a nervous system thing. Our nervous system is going to be, modulating that. And this is happening on the order of milliseconds. So before you've even formed the thought of doing something to your pelvic floor in time with footballs, it's already happened. You can't do it. And also thinking about the fact that most runners are running anywhere between 150 and 190 steps per minute.
It's impossible to try and kind of coordinate yes. your breath and your pelvic floor contraction with that strike, right?
That's right. Yeah. So you can see, you can ask them what they're thinking about, if anything, with their pelvic floor, and potentially, if they relate to you that they are consciously doing something, see if changing that makes a difference. And all of these come back to test retest. So we never keep something that isn't helpful. So it has to produce an improvement in order for us to be like, okay, yeah, we're going to continue on with that. And if the person in front of you is like, it's probably a no. It probably doesn't make enough of an improvement. It has to be like, yeah, that's better. And that could be, if they're running, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be like, oh, now I'm totally leak free. That's not realistic in many cases. But it could be that whereas before, if they, maybe could run, 2 minutes before they leaked, maybe now they can run 3 or 4 minutes. So we're looking for, improvements. We're looking for changes that we can build off of, depending upon the individual and what you're changing. You can potentially get really massive changes, but not always. And that's okay as long as you're moving forward towards that improvement. And then that global tension as well, right? So we can think about, are we fearful? Is that creating some tension within our whole body? So that's kind of tension. Moving on to impact, we can listen to their footfalls. So you've all, I'm sure, had the experience of hearing someone on the treadmill. They're like, they're on the next level above you or something, and an elephant is on the treadmill. Versus someone who scares you because they run up beside you so quietly that you don't even hear them coming. So we can modify impact. And, one of the things that we can do, which we're going to get to in strategy, is cadence. So the number of steps that we take per minute can sometimes do that. And there's lots of stuff that we can do that, but basically trying to get softer footfalls and less of that ground contact force.
While you're on that impact, have we got any research that shows a difference in a pelvic floor reactions with high impact, kind of stomping like, and softer footfalls? Is one better than the other, or we haven't got any of that concrete research that can say, this is easier on the pelvic floor than the other one?
Yeah, so most of our research comes from MSK research in regards to running, in regards to impact, stuff like that. What we know from MSK research, and what they'll do is they'll have these fancy treadmills where they have a force plate that's embedded within the treadmill. See that impact, that generally goes up with running speed. And then we also see that generally will go up with a lower cadence. So when we're taking bigger steps, and when we take bigger steps, we have more vertical excursion. So we're going higher up. And then sometimes we can also see a correlation between the foot striking pattern So if we have someone who is heel striking, sometimes we see that that's associated with a higher impact than someone who is midfoot or forefoot striking. So, in regards to a lot of that stuff, we know that when we increase someone's cadence, so we increase the number of steps that they're taking per minute, this does a lot of different things to our body. So it seems to be that at least in most bodies, an increase in cadence will decrease stress to the anterior shin, the knee, the hip, and the lower back. It does, however, increase stress at the Achilles and the calf and the foot itself. And that's basically like anything. We change movement and we're going to change the relative stress on different areas of the body, right? And that is something that's important for us to remember and to keep in mind. Because if we are say someone is an avid runner and they're putting in a lot of kilometers and we all of a sudden have a big change in how they run, we are going to be having also a concurrent shift in where stress is occurring in their bodies. And we need to be mindful and aware of that because we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. We don't want to change someone's running to improve their leaking and then end up doing such a drastic shift that increased loading gives them then the development of an Achilles tendinopathy, as an example. So it's important for us to be aware of and mindful of. But yeah.
Awesome.
All right. So that was impact. The next one is irritability. So with respect to leaking with running, the presence of bladder irritants in our diet can certainly impact how much leaking is occurring in some individuals. So very common bladder irritants are coffee. Yeah, I know, right? It's so sad.
No.
So coffee, anything with caffeine in it, carbonated beverages, any artificial flavors or colors, any foods that are highly acidic, these kind of things. So pre-workouts, we often call, bladder irritant soups because they often contain artificial flavors, sometimes artificial colors. They often contain caffeine and other stimulants that can act as bladder irritants. And then, obviously coffee, tea as well will have some caffeine and can act as a bladder irritant. And that is not to say that these individuals can't have these things. Their body, their choice. They can always decide what is best for them. But it could be that if, as an example, coffee is acting as a bladder irritant for me, and I want to go on a morning run, but I know that my leaking is exacerbated if I have coffee, it could be that I decide I am going to wait until after my run to have my coffee. And for some people, it's a dosage thing. So for some people, they can get away with 1 cup of coffee without it impacting their symptoms. But if they have 2 cups of coffee, then they are really feeling that bladder irritability. Everyone's different. So it's really about figuring out what your bladder irritants are, if you are having any that are affecting you, and then deciding, based on what those are and how they're affecting your system, deciding when you want to have those and when it's not worth it for you to have those, at least in that moment, depending upon what you're going to do. So that is irritability. And then the next one is posture and position. So looking at where are they in terms of their torso. So sometimes people, I'm just being aware that not everyone's going to have video here, so I'll explain it rather than show it. But if we have someone whose shoulders are really rounded and their ribs are really kind of crunched down, that can potentially be changing what's happening within their bodies. That could be affecting their leaking symptoms. And so trying to get them, long and lengthened as they're running in that situation where they're kind of scrunched down could potentially be of benefit for them, just as an example. How their body is moving through the air as they're going. So generally speaking, we like to see just a slight forward lean from the ankles. But sometimes people are very upright. I've even had runners that I've assessed that have a bit of a backward lean. And so those are different things that we can change as well. Moving on to pressure, that gets into, again, what's happening in terms of muscular recruitment through the abdominal canister. Sometimes we're pushing strollers, so we have a little bit more muscular effort through the trunk that could be affecting things. And that can also be affecting trunk rotation as well. When we don't rotate our trunks, when we don't have that nice 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock trunk rotation that's occurring with running, and things gonna get sort of locked down up top, that can certainly influence symptoms as well. So that would be something else that we would potentially look at changing. And breath, right? So are they really taking nice breaths where they're letting their belly go, they're really using their diaphragm, or are they having a lot of tension through their abdominal canister and just doing this really shallow chest breathing? Those are all things that we can potentially look at as well in regards to the pressure. And then moving on to strategy, this is where we can look at changing potentially their cadence, like what we've already talked about. And cadence is something that's quite easy to change. We can listen to their footfalls and use something like a Tempo Tap app and get a very real-time indication of what their current cadence is. And most of the MSK research will suggest that we stay within a 10% increase in cadence if we're going to adjust that. So just to be a bit mindful of that. So as an example, if someone had 150 as their cadence, the most I would want to increase that cadence at a given time would be 15 by 15, that 10%. So at most I'd take them up to a 165 for their cadence. You can always, like, once they're kind of adapted to that, you could potentially, change it further, but just watching out for that. And then also watching out for how much volume they're doing. So if it's someone who is just a beginner runner, they're not doing a ton of running volume, you could get away with, switching over their cadence, completely, and depending upon what else they're doing. But if you have someone who is, already quite an established runner, they already are doing quite high running mileage, you really want to be cautious with how much you're changing that. So you would kind of want to be incremental with that, because we need to make sure that the foot, the calf, and the Achilles are getting adequate time to recover and adapt to those increased loads and stresses that's going to place on it. So cadence is one thing that we can change. We can change footwear as well. Footwear is something that will often create automatic changes in how we're running. So for people who are, really heavy-footed, if they have a really highly cushioned shoe, that kind of creates like this nice marshmallow for them where they don't really feel any discomfort at their feet when they are really slamming the ground, and particularly if they're heel striking. But if you took that person and you put them in, you just, as an experiment, you tried to get them to do some barefoot running on a surface that was safe to do so, or into a minimalist shoe, and they no longer have that nice marshmallow underneath their foot that's absorbing the discomfort that they would otherwise experience at their foot, they will very often have these quick changes in how they're running to accommodate that, right? To avoid that impact due to discomfort. So footwear is something that you could potentially change. And then speed is another one. Terrain is another one. So we think about variability. Our nervous system loves variability. Our bodies typically love variability. So are we always doing the same route on the same type of terrain? Or are we potentially going to try to do something like, if someone is always running on like an asphalt multi-way, maybe we're going to try and do some trail running. Every footfall is going to be a little bit different if you're out on the trail, right? Versus if you're just doing road running. We could also look at whether we're doing uphill or downhill. So those are other things that fit into the strategy that we could potentially change. Some people will find that leaking with running is better when they run uphill. And so sometimes we'll have people start with that to build capacity. We'll have them do where they run up a hill and then walk down it, run up the hill, walk down it, to get their running in, get a little bit of the intensity they might be after, in a way that is working around their symptoms. So that is, I'm probably forgetting things, but that is basically strategy. And then sensitivity still matters. So sleep, stress, all the things that we've already talked about that I won't go into again because we've already chatted a lot about them. Those are all things that we would potentially still want to consider. Fatigue still applies, obviously. So as we get tired, we may find that leaking is getting more with running. And so we might, again, think about, well, where am I placing my run in my week or in my day? In terms of what other mechanical loading and what other, mechanical stimulus have I provided to my body that could potentially be creating fatigue? And how well fueled am I, and how well slept am I, and do I need to potentially modify my training around that to help support my pelvic floor so that I'm not leaking as much? And then capacity, building that capacity out over time. So in some cases, we will, optimize the tips as best as we can, making good improvements, but they still may find that they're leaking at a certain, duration. And that's okay. We can still work with that, and we can still lean into that and push that out over time. So we can do intervals, and we can look at the entire running volume throughout the week and how to, all of the normal stuff that we would do as a running coach for anyone, regardless of whether they were dealing with leaking, but taking that leaking into consideration as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love using TIIPPSS-FC, and the thing is, it's not only applicable with exercise, right? We spoke about some of our clients who may have like morning sickness and a lot of vomiting, and how we can apply it. So by just having that a bowl in front of them, as opposed to scrunching over the toilet seat, creating that pressure that may cause them to leak, or just allowing the vomit to come out and not fight it. So all those things really can make a difference towards the whole sort of experience, and the leaking and the reduction in the demand they may put on the pelvic floor, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can apply TIIPPSS-FC to leaking with morning sickness when we're unfortunately getting sick over the toilet, or during coughing or sneezing. Basically you can apply it to anything. I had someone that was in a few weeks back, and she was reporting that she lives on a farm, and there's this gate that she has to kind of jump up on to unlatch the gate. And every time she jumped up on that gate, she would leak when she kind of had that pressure onto her, that impact onto her abdomen when she jumped onto the gate. And we were able to eliminate her leaking with that activity by changing how she did that. So yeah, we can, and I mean, leaking is just part of it, right? So we can change things if their symptoms are not leaking, but maybe they're prolapse symptoms, or their pain, or even if they aren't having any symptoms, but they're looking to improve their performance in a given task or exercise.
So let's use one more example, and we're going to use a deadlift as an example. So say it's someone who has a prolapse, and usually the recommendation is don't lift heavy, right? That is the blanket recommendation that everybody with a prolapse almost gets told, don't lift heavy. How would you approach that person? Say they're an athlete and they love lifting, it's their life, it's a part of who they are, right? How would you kind of approach and help them be able to get that weight up?
Yeah, and I think that just to make a really quick comment on what you're talking about, and that's really honoring autonomy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And for me, that needs to be the foundation of everything. Your body, your choice, you get to decide, and my job is to support you and help you find ways that you can do that, giving you the information that so you can make the choices that are best for your body. So yes, I just wanted to point that out because I think that's so important and so great.
It is, yeah.
So yeah, how can we potentially change prolapse symptoms during a deadlift if someone was experiencing, say, a tampon sensation or feeling some heaviness during a deadlift? We're going to go through our TIPPS acronym again and again. This is not that you would apply absolutely everything, but these are, things that you could apply that could be relevant and important for the person in front of you. So tension, right? So are they really bracing? Are they using really strong pelvic floor contraction when they're doing that because they think that they need to. So looking again at that local level, and then also looking at that global level of what's happening within their whole abdominal canister, and seeing if we can modify that to change their experience with their prolapse symptoms. The impact is not relevant for deadlift. We don't really have an impact here, at least I hope we don't. We shouldn't. Irritability potentially could be at play here. So when we think about prolapse symptoms, was there anything that happened that potentially created some peripheral sensitization? So as an example, some people will report that their prolapse symptoms are exacerbated after they have penetrative intercourse. So that could potentially be a factor if it's something that they've never thought about. It could be like, hey, my deadlift was really bad this time and I don't know why. It's been okay before. That could potentially be something that's going on there. Some local irritability within those tissues that is driving increased symptoms. And then posture and position. So we can potentially change that up. It could be that we are going to change the position of their hips when they're doing it. It could be that we are going to, get their feet a little bit wider, get them into a little bit more of an upright torso. Lots of different things that we can potentially change there. We can look at what's happening at the top of their deadlift. Are they someone who is really kind of extending their back at the top of the deadlift? Are they really squeezing their glutes and pushing their hips forward at the top of their deadlift? All of these kind of things we might want to look at in terms of posture and position. And that can be also specific. You can ask the person in front of you, where are you experiencing your symptoms? So some people, it will be kind of that accumulative. So it's like they don't necessarily feel it at any given point in their deadlift, but after they've done a bunch of deadlifts, then they'll feel, kind of those prolapse symptoms. Or it could be that they do feel like that tampon sensation at a certain portion of their lift. And if they are having kind of that real-time feedback, then that's something that we can potentially change real time for them as well. The next one that we could look at is pressure. So are they wearing a weightlifting belt? If they are wearing a weightlifting belt, how are they wearing it? How are they applying that? And those are things that we can potentially change. So it could be that we're changing that they're going to try not wearing a belt at all, or it could be that we change how they're using that belt or how tight they have it on, or these kind of things. And again, we can look at all of the breath strategies. So are they doing an exhale as they do their lift? Are they doing an inhale as they do their lift? Are they doing a breath hold? If they are doing a breath hold, on what tidal volume are they doing that breath hold on? So, a lot of times when people are initially taught to deadlift, oftentimes they're coached to take that big breath in to really fill everything up, and then lock your glottis down, and then brace on that big breath of air. And if that's what they're doing, what if we didn't take this massive big breath? What if we took an inhale and then we exhaled half of that? So we had just, half of our total capacity filled, and then did a breath hold on that amount. So there's lots of different things that we can play with in regards to, breath holding versus not, and breathing through movement to see if we can change symptoms that occur with that. And then strategy, this is like all the stuff that the coaches that coach deadlifts are like, yeah, I know how to do that. That's great. That's my jam. you know, we can do conventional deadlift, or we could do a sumo deadlift. We could do, trap bar. We can change lots of different things here. Maybe we're going to do a kettlebell deadlift. Like, it really depends on the individual. And a lot of times people will think in those categories. So they'll think, okay, I've got conventional where my feet are right underneath my hips, or I've got sumo where they're wide out here. But there's all these foot positions in between. And so we don't necessarily have to, when we're working with someone, it doesn't have to be strictly what we traditionally think of as conventional or traditionally think of as sumo. There's lots of different variations in between those that could be what our person needs. Another interesting thing to consider is single leg variations.
I was going to say that because I've actually had people who have no symptoms when I move to single leg deadlifts, single leg jump rope. So they would leak with both legs. When it's single, no leaking whatsoever, right?
Love it.
Yeah.
So all the different things that we can do there, we can change range of motion, we can change load, we can change the speed of the lift. There's lots and lots of different things that we can play with there that many coaches are already well versed with in terms of changing the stuff in that strategy category. And then the sensitivity stuff still applies, right? So just like you were mentioning about how when your stress is higher, your prolapse symptoms may be higher. So just assessing and reflecting and reframing all of those kind of things to see, is that what's going on? Because a lot of people, again, and I think that it's because, in much of society and in much of healthcare and fitness education, there is that focus on structure. But a lot of people will automatically, their brain will go to the idea that my symptoms are worse, that means my structure is worse. And that's often not the case. So just because we might be feeling our prolapse more, that doesn't necessarily mean that our prolapse is any worse. It can be that sensitization is being driven up with no change in the tissues at all. And that could be for a number of different factors that we've already kind of chatted about. And then again, fatigue and capacity, just like what we talked about with running. How fatigued are you? All that kind of stuff. And then, do you need to build capacity? So if we are, challenging capacity, if this is a really heavy deadlift, maybe we do need to keep it a little bit lighter if it's those higher loads that are creating symptoms, and work towards that if that is a goal for that individual. The other thing that I just realized I forgot to mention for strategy, because we talk about like equipment as fitting into the strategy category. And the other thing is potentially looking at something like a pessary. So, just like if someone had, an issue with their ankle, they've had like recurrent ankle sprains, and then maybe they're going to play a basketball game and they wear, a lateral support for their ankle, or they tape their ankles up. We can potentially consider the same thing for providing pelvic organ support with a pessary. And for some people, that could be that they are only going to wear that pessary during exercise, if that's what's appropriate for them. Other people may be wearing their pessaries throughout daily activities as well. And for anyone that's listening that isn't aware of what a pessary is an intravaginal support, typically made out of medical grade silicone. And there's lots of different styles and sizes. There's ones that are ring shaped, ones that are kind of cube shaped. And they are something that would be fit to the individual, because we all are different shapes and sizes and need support in different areas. And sometimes there is some trial and error that goes into, finding the right pessary for the individual. It's not always the first one that you try that's going to be the one that works the best. And they also aren't for absolutely everyone. But that is another thing that if someone was having prolapse symptoms with deadlifting, could potentially consider as a way to modify their symptoms.
Amazing. Honestly, Teresa, I could chat to you about this stuff all day. but I do want to respect your time. Thank you so much. That was awesome. What are your plans? What's coming next? Have you got any plans for courses, for program? Because I want to be in all of them. You know this already.
That's that's wonderful. I hope that you are there, and I look forward to having you there and learning alongside you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so my plans are I'm continuing on as a senior teaching assistant with Anthony Lowe, so people will probably see me in and out of his projects. We also have a course that him and I are developing together. And then I also have my own solo course that's coming out that is based around TIIPPSS-FC. So if you're listening and you enjoyed the podcast today and you feel like TIIPPSS-FC is something that you'd like to know more about and really dive into all of these different components and how you can practically apply it, this is meant to be a simple, applicable, and adaptable framework to really blow up what you can do with helping people. So helping more people in more ways than hopefully you ever have before. So that TIIPPSS-FC course is going to be coming out with Reframe Rehab, and it is a live online course. And we're doing a Sunday time that hopefully should work for both the North American and the European folks. So hopefully that works well for everyone. And right now we haven't quite set a date, but that's happening probably within the next week. And it's going to be, we'll be doing one in probably April of 2021. And then in likely September of 2021 are the first two that we'll be doing this year. Hopefully, if we ever get back to being able to travel, I would love to do a live in-person TIIPPSS-FC course as well.
That would be amazing.
It would be so amazing. I am planning for the live online version with Reframe Rehab to be interactive, having you get the chance to experience how these things feel within your own body. It's going to be 2 separate Sundays, so they'll be able to, go away, practice with people, work through things, and then hopefully come back and then, get more. I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited to, do sort of that deep dive into this. And I like to think of it as symptom and movement science is really what we're doing.
Yeah, and I know we've spoken about this before, but how I coach and my strategies and my approach and my communication and my language has changed so much this past year because of the courses that I've been doing with yourself and Anthony. I know I'm kind of repeating this a lot, but as a fitness professional, this is not something that we get in certifications, right? So we have this one view of helping our clients. You either do this or you're weak, you have an imbalance, all these sorts of things. And we are not taught that there are other things that we can do, right? So there isn't point A to point B with like a narrow road. You can have like a motorway. Go by plane, go by bus, go by train. You can get to point B in so many other ways, right? So if you're a fitness professional or a physio or anyone who works within the health and fitness industry and you're listening to this or you're watching us, these are the courses that we need to take because it's what's going to help us help more people, is what's going to help us serve more people and empower them and make them feel strong and allow them not allow them but more like give them the freedom to do these things that they love in life and not stop them from doing those things, right?
Exactly.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for being here. It's amazing having you. I'm going to have you back on again, especially once the course is out, because I know you're going to be pretty busy now preparing for it and whatnot. But thank you for taking this time for talking to me, and everybody else is going to watch this and listen to this, and we'll catch up soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to connect with people.
Awesome.
So yeah, if you want to reach out to me through Instagram or through Facebook or anything, I'm happy to touch base with anyone through those means as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have all your details with the show notes and everything else. And then, yeah, everybody will be able to get in touch with you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
See you. Speak to you soon.
Yeah, okay, take care.
Bye.